Former President Trump may have been acquitted in his second impeachment trial, but his potential legal troubles are far from over. Mr. Trump has been stripped of certain protections now that he's returned to private life. That means the nation's courts could hold him accountable for his role in the Capitol riot. But there are a number of other potential charges beyond what the impeachment trial was centered on. A Georgia district attorney is investigating whether Mr. Trump broke election laws. And prosecutors in New York State have been looking into the Trump Organization for over a year for alleged financial crimes. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins me now from Los Angeles. She's a professor at Loyola Law School. Hi there, Jessica. So what might the federal criminal investigation into the Capitol riot look like, and how quickly is it moving?
It's actually moving quickly. I know for so many people, it feels like this happened a month ago and we saw it play out on television. Don't we know what we need to know? We've had an impeachment trial about it. And the answer is actually no, we're moving very quickly. And these investigations do take time. Right now, there have been about 200 to 205 people who have been arrested as a result of the actions that happened on January 6th. That could really just be the beginning. The federal investigators are still going through talking to a lot of the people who helped federal investigators by posting pictures and videos of themselves online. They're talking to them about why they did what they did, whether they thought they were doing that at the behest of the President of the United States. And there could be many more arrests, and there could be more charges, including of the President of the United States. So what does the investigation look like? Talking to the people who were there, who were involved in the activities, potentially talking to people who President Trump himself spoke to, trying to figure out what his state of mind was, what was his intent. And what could happen? There could be criminal charges against the president for incitement of the insurrection, but it's a really high standard. When it comes to trying someone for incitement of violence, in our country, that's a really high standard, and you absolutely find yourself kind of dancing around the First Amendment and making sure that we do not punish speech that is protected under the Constitution.
Well, at least 5 people died and several were injured during the insurrection. What kind of legal exposure could former President Trump face or have, rather, when it comes to victims or relatives of victims impacted by the Capitol riot?
Yeah, so this is such a good question. People who either themselves were impacted or, as you said, family members of people who were impacted could try and bring civil suits. They could say, President Trump, you are criminally negligent for what happened. And we've seen that in other situations, not just here, where the person who gives the speech at the rally people try to tie that person in terms of tort liability to what happened. And so what would need to be shown in this case essentially is that you can draw enough of a line between what the president said and then what happened. And the president's defense will be trying to say, look, I said these things and then these other things happened, but you can't draw enough of a line, enough of a connection such that you can impose tort liability, for instance, for negligence. And again, we're very concerned in our country about the First Amendment and speech. And so the same thing that we talked about for the criminal investigation, when it comes to these civil suits, the defense will be, you cannot punish me just because of what I said.
So during the Senate impeachment trial, House managers did show footage of rioters explicitly saying they were there because President Trump called them there. I mean, what's your assessment of that? As a strategy, does that notion that the president made me do it have teeth?
Yes, I actually think that's very important evidence, and we will now look to that when it comes to the criminal investigation that we were talking about, because it helps to establish one of the things we have to show, which is that the president actually intended to incite an insurrection, and that the speech was likely to lead to that insurrection. So without being able to go into the president's mind, what we do is we try and talk to other people, try and get the evidence, the factors that would indicate what the president was thinking at that time, because only then, only at that moment, is it fair to punish the president for what he said? So, yes, it is important that we talk to people and try and figure out what they understood the purpose of the speech to be, because that helps provide us with information about what the president wanted and intended and what was likely to occur.
So that being said, what constitutional protections, Jessica, are afforded a U.S. president after they've left office?
Well, as you said in the introduction, so at this point, the president loses the protection that the Department of Justice understands, meaning that you can't indict a sitting president. So now he really is, in many ways, on the same footing as any other private individual. He can assert First Amendment defenses. And of course, in our country, we are very careful and protective of the First Amendment. For anybody streaming this in Europe, for instance, this would sound strange to them. They would think that we would have more of a balancing test when it comes to the speech and the punishment. Now, there is some situation where we still have to be careful that the president was, in fact, the president when these activities took place, because he is still entitled to some executive protection. But I think it's a hard stretch to say that the president was giving this particular speech as part of the official powers and duties of his office.
Well, there are still questions over what the former president was doing while the riot was actually taking place. Jessica, explain how a phone call between former President Trump and Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy could prove to be key.
Yeah, this phone call, absolutely, as you said, it's really important. And it goes to the same thing we were just talking about with respect to the rioters, the people who are actually in the Capitol, which is, what did the president know? What did he intend? And when did he know it? So in this case, that phone conversation between Congressman Kevin McCarthy and the president, it could go to, one, what the president knew was happening. Somebody told him, we are in trouble here, Mr. President. We are in danger. You need to call this off. You need to tell your supporters to stop this. So because there was some discussion in the impeachment about when the president knew that things turned violent. It also, again, goes to the president's state of mind, because the reporting is that the president said, well, Kevin, I guess those people are a lot more concerned about the outcome of the election than you are. That would go to whether or not the president thinks that this is potentially acceptable behavior, whether he wanted this behavior. Again, we're trying to kind of look at all these other things, these conversations, what people understood from what the president said, and therefore kind of jump into the president's mind and say, what would be fair for a jury to determine the president intended when he made that speech, and frankly, in the days leading up to that speech and the months leading up to that speech, situating the whole thing in context, again, to determine, is it fair to impose either criminal or civil liability here?
Finally, Jessica, we mentioned Mr. Trump is facing two separate cases in Georgia and New York. How could those cases impact whether or not federal prosecutors working on the Capitol riot decide to bring charges?
Well, they could impact it in the sense that there might be some discussion of timing and what type of timing would be appropriate if there are, in fact, indictments. If you would allow me, I think that those investigations are much more likely to lead to an indictment than anything that happened as a result of January 6th. If you look at what happened in New York, the investigation, there's an 18-month investigation there dealing with essentially potential financial crimes, payments for hush money payments that were maybe made on behalf of the president. And then in Georgia, looking at the phone call between the president and the Secretary of State, essentially trying to figure out if the president tried to commit election fraud. I think those investigations are more likely to bear fruit. Or if you look at a federal investigation and try and figure out which federal investigation is more likely to lead to an indictment, I actually think it's the information coming out of the Mueller report dealing with obstruction of justice, or the information coming from President Trump's personal attorney testimony dealing with campaign finance violations. Everything involving the insurrection, there's a lot of legal landmines there. It doesn't mean it's an unwinnable case. It means they're really hard cases to bring.
All right, Jessica Levinson. Jessica, always great to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.